and it seemed like a lifetime. I've been hanging every day from a lifeline. Body's fucking tailored than every night.
What zero represents is Joe Biden's understanding of the U.S. economy, because he has no clue what's going on. You can't brag about the fact that we had one lone month where high prices didn't get any higher. It's not like they went down. They just didn't go up. But if people were struggling with high prices, their struggle didn't get any easier. It remained the same. What would have been good is if prices could have come down, but they didn't come down. And in fact, the only reason that the headline number didn't go up was because we finally got some relief at the pump. Gas prices came down, but a lot of other prices, food prices keep going up, rents keep going up. We are nowhere near done with this inflation problem. It is going to be here for years and years and years, probably the remainder of this decade, and probably then some. As they keep telling us, this is a very unique recession. In fact, most people don't even want to admit that we have one. But look at the recessions of the 1970s. You had rising prices there. I was predicting the U.S. economy would be in recession in the first half of 2022, and very few people had that right. But I also predicted that inflation wasn't transitory, that it would get stronger as the economy got weaker, and that is exactly what happened. Now, the reason that I believe that inflation is going to kick into a higher gear as this recession that we are in gets worse is because I believe Powell is going to pivot ultimately, and he is going to give up his fight against inflation in order to fight a different foe, and that is going to be a recession and rising unemployment and potentially a financial crisis, either one that has already happened or one that is rapidly approaching. And so I think Powell is going to choose what he believes to be the lesser of the two evils, and I think he's going to pick fighting recession and propping up financial markets and monetizing government debt so the Treasury doesn't have to default. I think the Fed is going to pick that over inflation. And so unlike the pivot that we got with Volcker back in 1982, where Volcker pivoted after a victory in his fight against inflation, Powell is going to pivot despite defeat. Inflation is going to win. And so when we go back to 0% interest rates or whatever we do, and when we go to QE5, which is going to be launched, I don't think the Fed is going to shrink its balance sheet very much. It's going to shrink it less than it did last time it tried to do it, which is an impossible task given the bubble gets inflated. I think when the Fed goes back to stimulus and creating inflation, when inflation is maybe double or triple or quadruple that 2% target, the markets are going to react very differently than how they reacted in the past. Because in the past, the Fed was able to justify all this cheap money because they said we don't have enough inflation. We're still below target. Well, when they go back to this stimulus, when inflation is triple or more their target, the markets aren't going to buy it. And so I think all the inflation that they are going to have to create in order to stimulate the economy out of this recession is going to ignite a powder keg. We already have an inflation problem, and Powell's going to pour all this gasoline on it, and so we're going to see inflation moving up to a much higher level, even though it's already very high. In fact, it's probably double what the government claims in the CPI. If you want to know what's actually happening to prices, you've got to double what the government tells you, and that's more accurate. Meanwhile, labor force participation last month fell to 62.1. That is the low for the year. And in fact, over the last 4 months, even though we've created all these jobs, the number of people in the workforce has gone down. And so that means that all the jobs that were created over the last 4 months were people who already had a job getting another job. You know, Biden claimed that we have a record number of people in the workforce. He was mistaken. We had more people working 4 months ago than we have working now. The record high for the number of people working is before the pandemic. So even though we've recovered the jobs that we lost prior to the pandemic, it's only because the same people have multiple jobs. We haven't recovered the workers. We still have a lot of workers that were working prior to the pandemic that haven't rejoined the labor force. We can't have a soft landing because a soft landing means we avoid recession. So by that definition, we've already crashed, or it's a hard landing. It is what it is. And so you have all these Keynesians that somehow believe that inflation is caused by economic growth. They also think it's caused by too many people working. They think there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. They think if there's not enough people unemployed, you're going to have more inflation, and the way to get rid of inflation is to put people out of work. All of this is Keynesian nonsense. Inflation is not caused by the private sector. It's not caused by growth. It's not caused by people working. The only people working that cause inflation are the people at the Fed who are running the pretty presses, or are pushing all the buttons that are creating all the money. That's where inflation comes from. And they create inflation in order to monetize U.S. government debt. So the federal government runs a big budget deficit, the Federal Reserve prints up money to buy those bonds, and that inflation enters the economy. It's got nothing to do with growth or people working. As a matter of fact, in a real economy, the stronger the growth, the lower prices. Because what is economic growth? It means increased output. It means more goods and services are being produced. Well, if you increase the supply of something, then you decrease the price. So a productive economy that's producing more stuff means that the price of that stuff is lower. The same thing with people working. If more people are employed productively, Their productive output is increasing the supply of goods and services, keeping the prices down. If you slow down real economic growth, if you force people out of work, you're going to have less supply. We're not going to make as much stuff. We're not going to be offering as many services. And so therefore the prices of those goods and services, all else being equal, are going to go up. Supply creates demand. So if people are producing and putting goods and services into the economy, well, now they have the ability to share in that production. They've earned money helping to create stuff, and now they can spend that money to buy the stuff that they created. And so the demand that comes from real production doesn't cause prices to go up. The only kind of demand that causes prices to go up is when the government just prints money and gives it to people. And so that money is not a function of production. People didn't earn that money producing. They just were sent the money by the government. I mean, that's what happened during COVID to a huge degree. You had people who had jobs and were working to help make stuff. They went home. They weren't working at all. They weren't making anything. But now the government sent them money. They weren't earning money because they worked. They were being paid not to work. But the worst part about it was many people were paid 2 or 3 times not to work than what they earned when they were working. So now these people who weren't working at all had all this money to go and buy stuff, but they didn't help produce any stuff. That's what pushed up prices, because you had all this fake demand and no supply. You see, the proper monetary policy response to the pandemic, if everybody was going to stop working, the Fed should have shrunk the money supply, not expanded it. The U.S. government should have cut spending, not spent more. That would have balanced out supply and demand. But instead, we had the worst combination of monetary and fiscal policy probably in the history of the country. In the face of collapsing supply, we flooded the economy with phony demand. And so we're experiencing now, I think, just the beginning of those consequences. We've got a long way to go, which is why the idea that inflation has peaked is nonsense. Historically, whenever they brand a piece of legislation, whatever the name is, the effect will be the opposite of that name. So if a bill is called the Inflation Reduction Act, then you know right off the bat, the effect of the bill is going to be to increase inflation. And that's exactly what it's going to do. First of all, there's all this new government spending. That's more demand, artificial demand, coming into the economy. How is the government going to get all this money that it's going to spend? Because it's not going to get it from those tax hikes. It's ultimately going to get it from the Fed. The Fed is going to have to print more money to monetize those debts. Now, even if the Fed doesn't do that, and the government has to find private buyers for those bonds, well, then it's going to crowd out investment in the private sector. And so that's going to mean fewer things are going to be produced, because the private sector is going to have less money to invest in capital and things to improve productivity. And so that ultimately causes prices to be higher. So will the increase in corporate taxes, because to the extent that corporations have to pay higher taxes, it comes at the expense of lower investment. So if corporations have less money to invest in plant equipment and expanding supply, that ultimately puts upward pressure on prices. What the government needs to do to reduce inflation is reduce government spending. We need a bill that cuts government spending. The government is doing the opposite. They are increasing government spending. So what they're doing is they are throwing gasoline on a fire that's already burning hot. The government makes everything more expensive. It's the free market that makes things less expensive. So if we want to help put downward pressure on prices, we got to get government out and let the free market in. Now, in fact, they may be cutting interest rates before the end of this year, but it's not going to be because they've won a victory over inflation. It's going to be because the economy is in a much more severe recession than the one it's in right now. In other words, this recession that's here is going to get worse, and that's going to force politicians to try to do something. You know, once the political pressure is greater because of unemployment and the economy, then the Fed is going to switch its attention from inflation. But the inflation problem is not going to go away. It's just that this other problem is going to loom larger in the eyes of the Fed. And I think what's driving the markets is this bad news on the economy is good news for the markets, because it means the Fed will pivot sooner. And before it pivots, it will raise rates less than it might have raised, absent the bad economic news. And again, you still have all of these Keynesians out there that think bad economic news is good news on inflation. They think the weak economy will weaken inflation. It won't. It is going to strengthen inflation, especially when the Federal Reserve and the government respond to the weakening economy with more stimulus, because that stimulus is inflation. So they're going to start creating more inflation, even though we already have too much inflation. And so the problem is going to get much bigger than the markets understand. I still think this is an overall bear market. I think that rate hikes are going to continue to take their toll, but so will inflation. I think inflation is going to harm a lot of companies that have a problem dealing with it. I think a lot of demand is going to be destroyed for a lot of discretionary items, because people are going to spend all their money on food, on energy, on insurance, on rent, on taxes. Well, I think the nature of this financial crisis is going to be a lot different than the one we had in 2008, because I don't think the Fed is going to allow it. That's one of the reasons I believe that Powell is going to pivot, because if the the Fed does keep raising rates, we will have a financial crisis that looks like 2008, only much worse. Because 2008 was about bad debt. It was about people borrowed money and they couldn't pay it back, and the collateral for the loans was no good because it was real estate and prices went down. Well, we have much more debt now than we had in 2008. I mean, by an order of magnitude. Everybody has more debt than they had back then. And so this is going to be a much bigger crisis when the defaults start. And all those banks that were too big to fail, that were bailed out in 2008, they're a lot bigger now. And when they fail, it's going to be a lot worse, except with inflation too high and the Fed fighting inflation, there are no bailouts. There's no TARP 2.0. All these banks are going to have to be allowed to fail. And that means customers are going to lose money, not just stockholders or bondholders. The customers are going to lose money because the FDIC doesn't have any money unless it gets it from the Fed. And the Fed isn't going to be giving out money if it's fighting inflation. It's taking away money. So I believe the Fed is going to pivot to prevent that massive financial crisis. And so what we're going to get is a sovereign debt crisis and a US dollar crisis. So it's going to take the form of a crashing dollar. And so the people who are going to lose money are not the people that are just holding subprime mortgages, but the people who are holding US Treasury bonds or any bonds denominated in US dollars, or even people that have US dollars stuffed under their mattress. You know, the dollar has risen so far in the early stages of this big inflation because investors are still delusional about the Fed's ability to contain inflation and bring it back down to 2%. When they wake up to reality that inflation is going to be way above 2% indefinitely, then the dollar is going to fall through the floor, and then things like gold and silver will go through the roof. Remember, in 1971, the U.S. defaulted on its obligations because Nixon took us off the gold standard. But prior to that, if you owned a Federal Reserve note and you were a foreign central bank, you owned an obligation of the United States government to pay you gold. Federal Reserve notes were notes for gold. And the U.S. government defaulted on those notes. We told all of our international creditors, we promised to pay you gold. If you had $35, we promised you an ounce of gold. And they did a couple of devaluations first, but that wasn't enough. And then Nixon said, you know what? We're going to default completely. We're going to give you no gold for your notes. We're going to pay nothing. So that was an official default. And then gold went from $35 an ounce up to $850. So people who had U.S. Federal Reserve notes thought they were going to get a certain amount of gold. They ended up getting a fraction of that gold because the value of the dollar imploded relative to gold because we defaulted on that promise. And I think it's going to lose its status as the reserve currency, and that is going to be a game changer for the U.S. economy because we rely on the ability to exchange the paper we print, U.S. Federal Reserve notes, dollars, for the goods the rest of the world produces. We don't have to produce goods in exchange, and that's been the free ride that we've had on this global gravy train, and that's going to come to an end, and that's going to have profound implications for the U.S. economy and the standard of living of America. I think the economy is in horrible shape. I think that's one of the reasons that President Biden is so unpopular, because I think a lot of the people who are struggling in this economy in part blame the president. He's not solely responsible, but he certainly hasn't done anything to help. Everything he's done is actually taken a bad situation and made it worse. But if you look objectively at the data, the savings rate is at the lowest it's been since 2007. I think it's down to 2.3%. So Americans have blown through all their stimulus money, and now they're pretty much broke. If you look at credit card debt, it's at an all-time record high. So Americans are struggling to put food on the table and to pay the electric bill, and so they're borrowing more money on their credit cards. If you look at what's happening to wages, they are declining in real terms. And I think the real decline is being masked by the fact that we are understating inflation. I think the actual inflation rate is about double what the government will admit to, and that means that the real decline in wages is much greater, which explains why so many people are now moonlighting. A record number of Americans have 2 and 3 jobs. In fact, you have more Americans than ever that are working 2 full-time jobs. Most people don't do full-time jobs. Most people don't want multiple jobs. They would prefer to be able to support themselves and their family on one job. But unfortunately, in the Biden economy, that's not possible. And that's where all these jobs that are being created are going. They're going to people who don't want more jobs, but who are forced to take them anyway, because that's the only way that they can keep up with the rising cost of living. They're being very disingenuous, and that's a nice way of putting it about these numbers, because the implication is that, 260,000 people who didn't have jobs, who were unemployed, now they've got jobs. That's not what happened. All of those jobs went to people who were already employed. They are part-time jobs. That's what's happening. And it's not a great economy where people who have jobs need to get a second job. They would rather have the leisure. They would rather be able to spend more time with their families. But unfortunately, they can't afford that. They have to go and get another job. And that is where these jobs are coming from. If people come out of retirement, let's say somebody was retired, they're 70 years old, they were looking forward to just playing golf and going to the beach and hanging out with their grandkids, but now they have to go take a job at Target because that's the only way to pay the grocery bill. Do you want to brag about creating an economy where unemployed people are forced to go back into the workforce? The main reason that the unemployment rate is so low is so many people who aren't working are not counted as being unemployed. We have over 100 million working age Americans who are no longer in the labor market. But I'm sure a lot of the people there are just discouraged workers. You know, you don't count. If you've basically given up looking for a job because you don't think there's a job out there that you're qualified for and a wage that makes sense for you to take the job, after a year, you don't count even in the U6 number, which includes discouraged workers and people who are only working part-time but would prefer to work full-time and who are still looking for full-time employment but can't find it. There, the unemployment rate, I think, is closer to 7%. But even that unemployment rate, once you've been discouraged for over a year, you're no longer counted in that number either. So I think if you objectively measured the unemployment rate and included all the people who are not working but who would be working if they believe they can find a job, or who have settled for a part-time job when they prefer a full-time job, I'm sure the actual unemployment rate is in the double digits. The savings rate, again, is 2.3%. That's the most recent number that was released last week by the government. We haven't had savings that low since 2005. But one of the reasons that Americans weren't saving in 2005 is because they had so much home equity. They were just getting rich off the real estate. That was the peak of the real estate bubble. But right now, Americans are losing their home equity. Real estate prices are now falling, but what's more problematic is real wages are falling because the cost of living is going up, and credit card debt has exploded. So if Americans really had all this savings, credit card debt wouldn't be skyrocketing. The reason credit card debt is going up so much is because people don't have savings. They can't afford to buy things. They have to borrow the money. But more of the money that they're borrowing is being spent on food. It's being spent on electricity, on gas. I mean, look at all the big retailers that are reporting that their customers are spending more money on food and less money on everything else because food is so expensive.
The credit card situation is scary. It's a sickening feeling to see those cards run up, and the people who run it up, the vast majority of people, I think, who have enormous credit card debt are buying things they do need, and they'd rather not have it on credit, but they don't have the cash. It's stomach-turning to see the bills run up and to see the interest rates go up, and the interest rates go up and up and up, and I can only imagine it would make people feel kind of angry at the Fed for, every time they raise one of these rates, you owe more.
Yeah, you're looking at credit card rates now that are about 20%. And that is a huge amount of interest to pay. And, I think a lot of people today have a lot more consumer debt than just their credit card debt, because over the last few years, a lot of these buy now, pay later companies have come into existence. People are using those companies to buy stuff without money, but it doesn't show up in the credit card numbers because it's not credit card debt, but it's still debt that the consumer is obligated to repay. And I don't believe they're going to be able to do it.
It seems insurmountable. What happens? Is there some credit card default crisis that is the mirror image of the housing crisis? You referenced 2005 and going into the 2008 collapse. What's going to happen with all that credit card debt?
Yeah, the credit card debt is non-secure. If you don't pay it, the credit card company, they can't come after your assets. They can't put a lien on your house or try to go after your IRA. The debt is very difficult to collect if the person doesn't have any money. It's also dischargeable in bankruptcy. We haven't seen a big spike up in credit card delinquencies, but I think that's coming in 2023. And what also happens with credit card debt is once somebody with credit card debt recognizes that they can't pay it back and they've decided they're not going to pay it back or that they're going to file for bankruptcy, what they will do before is max out their credit card. They'll just borrow as much money as they can because whatever they're buying, they're getting for free, right? So if you're planning on going bankrupt and you have $50,000 worth of credit card debt, but you still have another $50,000 that you can borrow, well, you're going to do it. You're going to go out and spend the other $50,000 and buy as much stuff as you can, because when you go bankrupt, you don't have to return that stuff. If you go out and you buy a bunch of clothes and some consumer electronics or take a vacation, and then you file for bankruptcy, you don't have to give any of that stuff back. And it makes sense that before you file for bankruptcy to buy as much as you can, because once you declare bankruptcy, you're not going to get any new credit cards for a while. So you might as well buy everything you can before you go bankrupt. So you get that moral hazard that's going to accelerate the losses for the banks that are issuing the credit.
Murder on call with the fight now. 20 years and it seemed like a lifetime. I've been hanging every day from a lifeline. Bodies fucking tailer than